Hello, and welcome to the Stand Up Fight Back podcast. I'm your host, Chris. The Stand Up Fight Back podcast is a new show that features authors discussing their work and experiences with a particular focus on promising organizing projects, on anti-oppression solidarity work, and on looking forward to future change and resistance. On this first episode, we'll be speaking with Ruth Kinna, professor of political theory at Loughborough University in England. She's the author of A Beginner's Guide to Anarchism, and has edited or co-edited the Continuum Companion to Anarchism, Anarchism and Utopianism, and Libertarian Socialism, Politics in Black and Red. She helps coordinate the Anarchism Research Group, which is a group of about 20 academics with the aim of raising the profile of anarchist studies in academia, of helping postgraduate researchers work on anarchist history and politics, and on encouraging the exploration and analysis of anarchist ideas and practices in the local community. She co-convenes the Anarchist Studies Network and is the editor of the peer-reviewed journal Anarchist Studies. Please welcome her onto the show. And in 2 weeks, the next episode will feature Brian Tokar, who is the director of the Institute for Social Ecology and who wrote the book Toward Climate Justice. But without further ado, let's go speak with Ruth. I'll talk to you after the break. Bye.
So Ruth, you've spent your pretty much your whole academic career researching anarchism and organizing and supporting other academics who are researching anarchism. What got you interested in academia, and why do you focus on anarchism and socialism?
Okay, so I'll start with the second part of the question first, which is how I got into anarchism and socialism. And that really arose as a result of studies I did as an undergraduate. And I did a degree in history and politics. And in the course of that degree, I took two courses in particular, one which looked at the Spanish Revolution and the Civil War and introduced me to the anarchist movement in Spain. And the second was a course which was taught by William Fishman, and it was organized or based around a book that he'd written called The Insurrectionists. And it told a history of socialist thought from an anarchist perspective. So it took us from the French Revolution through to the Russian Revolution, and basically examined critically the problems of vanguard politics, I suppose. So those two things together brought me into a sort of a literature that I hadn't been aware of, which was anarchist, because most of the politics that was sort of dominant, or the left politics that was dominant at the university at the time, was very strongly Marxist. And it was at that point that I decided that what I wanted to do was to look more closely at the anarchists and try and work out why it was that they'd been pretty much written out of socialist histories, and what was distinctive about anarchism. I was just, it was something that it just resonated with me, I suppose. And because I had the opportunity to study at postgraduate level, I decided that what I was going to do was write a thesis on anarchism, which eventually I did do. And I suppose as time went on, academia seemed to be, the only place, or one of the few places, that was going to allow me the time or actually recognize the value of what I'd been spending all this time doing in a PhD dissertation. So I kind of went into academia as something that I thought I could do, and as something that would allow me the flexibility to continue doing what I wanted to do, which was to carry on reading about anarchists and anarchism. not exclusively anarchist anarchism. I mean, I am still interested in other sort of unorthodox or dissident forms of socialism.
Can you talk a little bit more about your dissertation, your PhD dissertation? What was that focused on? What did that look like?
Okay, so I started off with the idea that what I was going to do was an account of the influence of Bakuninist and Kropotkinite ideas on Spanish anarchist movements. And that turned out to be way too big and far too difficult for me to do. So in the end, what I ended up doing was a thesis on Kropotkin's political thought. And I became interested in the way in which his concept of mutual aid had been represented, or as I saw it, misrepresented in existing literature. And I wanted to correct the view that Kropotkin was a sort of a crude evolutionary theorist who thought that anarchy was the natural outcome of historical development. And I wanted to look at the way in which he'd understood science and the way in which he'd used science as a kind of a tool to propagate his ideas. So the thesis was called Kropotkin's Theory of Mutual Aid, I think, and it focused specifically on him. And my interest still, it's not just on Kropotkin, but I still think that Kropotkin has had a fairly bad press within the anarchist movement. I'm still a sort of a defender of his thought.
Who do you feel is less accepting of his work, or what's like strains of anarchist thought?
I think that it's not that people are perhaps less accepting of Kropotkin, but that he's been sidelined by a set of circumstances, if you like, of no one's particular making, but that he's become associated with a current of anarchism which is outmoded. So it's rooted in a set of or in a context which seems to be distant to us, and he seems to be an advocate of a set of ideas that don't resonate anymore with the kind of political context in which we operate. He looks like he's become a canonical figure, and I think rightly within the anarchist movement, there's suspicion that we should, or suspicion of authoritative voices, if you like, and a sense in which we shouldn't be referring to particular writers to find our answers. I agree with all of that. I just think that in the process of questioning the formation of an anarchist canon and questioning the relevance of 19th century politics to 21st century activism, we've perhaps lost sight of some of the valuable insights that Kropotkin and other historical writers provide us with.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think that's a good jumping off point to get into the Beginner's Guide for Anarchism, which you wrote. And specifically, when you were starting to talk about how to understand anarchism, you tried to explore three lenses: key celebrities or thinkers like Kropotkin, schools of anarchist thought, and the history of anarchism. Through these lenses, you explored the tension that comes from analysts or thinkers trying to assert a, quote, unity of tradition on a set of ideas that are not only diverse, but also often incompatible. Can you talk a little bit about people trying to summarize anarchism?
I suppose what I wanted to do was write an introduction that didn't come down hard on a particular view, which sort of said anarchism is this, as opposed to anarchism is something else, because it seemed to me that I'm very sympathetic to the view that Uri Gordon puts, that anarchism is something that you kind of recognize when you see it. But at the same time, it seems to me that if you recognize something when you see it, then there must be reference points that allow you to make that kind of identification. So what I wanted to do was to try and set out some of the reference points that frame the ways in which we can think about anarchism, in order then to consider how what was historically located and geographically located, became much more diverse and much more interesting and much more malleable, so that we could think creatively about what it means to be questioning authority, or what it means to be resistant, or what it means to be anti-political in an anarchist sense. So it was an attempt really to sort of avoid saying that anarchism was one particular thing or could be understood in only specific ways, and to try and say, well, look, we can identify a tradition, but the point of identifying the tradition is to be creative with it.
And so, as part of that tradition, you identify the different schools of thought of anarchism, which can be a little bit confusing. So I'm hoping we can go through them kind of one by one here. Could you tell us a little bit about anarcho-communism, what that is?
Okay, so the schools of thought are, again, they're quite fluid. So you can pick up different books and you'll find different kinds of schools of thought identified. But some of them are much more historically located, in the sense that there were specific campaigns at different times to shape the anarchist movement in particular ways. And anarcho-communism comes from one of those sort of internal discussions, if you like. And it arises, I suppose, in the mid to late 1870s, when a group of anarchists, and Kropotkin is one of them, start to argue that the only way that you can have an anarchist society that's going to avoid falling into the kinds of inequalities that will support power imbalances is to ensure that people have their needs met, so that no one can accumulate more than anybody else, and everybody can live in ways that allow them to relate to each other in through an ethic of mutual aid. So the idea of communism was that it was support an anarchist ethic, and it was specifically associated with an economic principle of distribution according to need. And the idea of or how you would organize a communist society in an anarchist way was fleshed out in terms of resolving the problem, or trying to resolve the problem, of developing an economic system that actually did provide for people's needs without having very complex and highly centralized systems of distribution to ensure that everybody had their needs met by a central sort of administrative structure. And that's a massively difficult problem. And the way that Kropotkin resolves it, and the way that other people have thought about resolving it, is to think about decentralizing production so that you meet people's needs on local levels.
And so what differentiates that vision of sort of federated communism from anarcho-syndicalism?
So I think the distinctions are not hard and fast. So some people who would call themselves syndicalist are also communist, and some people who call themselves anarcho-communist will also identify with syndicalist struggles. So there are sort of complex relationships between the two. But syndicalism emerges again partly through a sort of a historical practice. So what happens within the anarchist movement at the turn of the century, or the late 1890s and the turn of the century, is that you have the development of a number of really important union organizations, which are anarchist to the extent that they don't seek to work with established political parties. They seek to work autonomously from political parties, and they seek to realize or to take over ownership of the means of production through direct action within these union movements. Now, if there's going to be, or where there are differences traditionally between anarcho-communists and syndicalists, it tends to be in the way in which they think the economic arrangements can be made in a post-revolutionary society. And the syndicalist tends to think in terms of federating across those union structures rather than thinking in terms of decentralizing within communities. Now, you can have two things working together. So you could have a syndicalist, as I say, you could have a syndicalist society which was also attentive, if you like, to local communal needs. But I think the suspicion on behalf of some anarchist communists was that what would happen through syndicalism is that you would have quite strong structures which would hold the risk, if you like, of losing touch with the communities that they were supposed to serve. So it wasn't so much a kind of a fundamental disagreement between people who called themselves communists and syndicalists. It's an argument about how best you organize an anarchist economic system.
So a lot of these schools of thought are maybe more about focusing on how to achieve change, and then different ideas to how to organize future society after some revolution in the future, as opposed to maybe hard and fast dividing lines between ideologies. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so, and I think there's a lot of these distinctions arise through, some of them arise through theoretical disagreements. So there are clear disagreements between anarchist communists, for example, and people who call themselves individualists, who are not interested in organizing distribution according to need. Actually, what they want to do is organize distribution according to, or they tend to want a distribution of equal rights, so that people can provide for themselves, as opposed to think about, communal needs or needs of people organized within communities. But so some of those disagreements can be theoretical, and they're rooted in different sort of concepts, if you like, or the priority attached to different concepts. And some of them emerge from the practice of organizing. But I think in each case, I think certainly in terms of syndicalism, the idea of syndicalism is that because you can organize you can organize within unions in capitalist society. Actually, through that organization, you can push revolutionary change. So although there is a kind of a sense in which there is an idea of revolutionary struggle and resistance, actually the society that you build as a result of your syndicalist activity comes through that process of organization.
Well, I'm glad you brought up more individualist or anarcho-capitalist views, because your guide takes a very broad stance on anarchism, and you kind of understand anarchism as, in general, a rejection of the state, with then a lot of individual ideas and more positive ideas underlying that, or that individuals or different groups of thought believe beyond that. And so you include anarcho-capitalism and also like anarcho-capitalist thinkers within your work in a way that I don't think a lot of anarchists necessarily would. Can you talk about why you included these individualist voices?
Okay, so I think, well, I was asked to, is the short answer. The structure of the book, though, because I do take seriously the idea that anarchism is linked to anti-statism, and that's a distinctive feature of anarchism. The way I understand anarchism makes it quite difficult to make very hard and fast distinctions between people who call themselves individualists but who are egalitarian, and people who call themselves communist or collectivist, or who otherwise sort of identify with socialist traditions. So I do think that there's it's a kind of that distinction is quite porous. But I would make a distinction in general, actually, between people who are anarchist and anti-capitalist, and those who are not. And I think what I do in the book is suggest that people who call themselves anarcho-capitalists are quite clearly distinguished from mainstream anarchist traditions. They're free market, they support free markets, they support individual accumulation, they support all kinds of things, but that there are people within anarchist movements who call themselves individualists who would be quite closely aligned because they're egalitarians with other anarchists. And I think that's the relationship between those two currents is a useful and valuable one.
Cool. Yeah, that's really interesting. Who asked you to include all of those voices?
Okay, so it was the publisher thought that I should, or the reviewer of the book before it was published suggested that I should include some of the characters who sort of sneak in at the end. But the original draft didn't include Rothbard and it didn't include Rand.
Yeah, I was when I was reading through it, I was just a little bit surprised to see those names in there. But it actually was an interesting kind of a current to add to it, even if it doesn't necessarily align with my understanding of anarchism to include them.
No, well, and in the second edition, in fact, they came out.
Oh well, I guess I'm reading the Kindle version from Amazon.
Right, okay.
Yeah. I don't know. Anyway, so can we talk a little bit about mutualism and collectivism and sort of what those related streams of thought are?
Okay, so mutualism is associated with Proudhon, and mutualism is described an arrangement where, or I suppose Proudhon's idea that you could have a kind of a contractual relationship between individuals, but in order to support mutual exchange, so that you would maintain social relationships through the mutual recognition of or through mutual exchange, and individuals would come together through the labour that they did and through the surpluses they produced, and using those surpluses to exchange for things that they couldn't produce. That was, and there would be a kind of a people's bank that would facilitate mutualism. Collectivism describes a system of, again, it's supposed to be egalitarian, but it describes a system which is based on distributing according to work. So the idea of collectivism is that individuals have, or they might work collectively or in groups, as it were, but that families or individuals who do the work can then take according to the effort that they've put in. Okay, and the communists thought that this was, again, a risky kind of situation or system of organizing, because it would allow some people to own more than others, and it discriminated or it disadvantaged people who couldn't make the same kinds of efforts. So there were concerns about what you would do about people who couldn't work for one reason or another, people who were looking after children, and all the rest of it. But all of these systems were designed to be egalitarian. It's just that they had different understandings of the way in which you could operate an egalitarian system in practice.
And so, what is then anarcho-primitivism, which is a newer form or way of thinking about anarchism?
Okay, primitivism is associated, I suppose. I mean, primitivism comes from a very from a deep concern with technology and the ways in which technology structures our world, and is sort of implicit or within sort of capitalist production. So technology is not some neutral tool that we can use for good or ill. Actually, technology is part of the way in which we live. It's something that we can't sort of easily escape from. And the idea of primitivism is that we should be as questioning of technology as we should be of capitalism itself, and that we should also seek to to challenge some of the ways in which our social relationships have become mediated through technology. So one of the arguments that primitivists make is that we've lost touch with different forms of communicating with each other, with non-verbal communication. We've lost touch of our relationship to the natural world. The primitivism is slightly misleading to the extent that it suggests that what primitivists want to do is to sort of destroy everything that exists and return to some kind of golden age. They don't think that. But what they do suggest is that we can learn from anthropology in particular, and the ways in which other groups of humans have lived and organized in order to think about some of the harms that we do ourselves through the ways in which we live and through our sort of our practices of consumption and production.
It also seems to me a little bit fatalistic or maybe deterministic, where, just like kind of Marx was saying, we would eventually arrive at communism because of the arc of history that would take us there. It kind of seems like anarcho-primitivists are arguing, well, we are on the fast track to ecological collapse, and because of capitalism, because of these states that are not willing to rein in capitalism, things are going to collapse anyway. Is that a sort of strong motivating factor in these movements, or are people also arguing that we should get rid of technology?
Well, I think the idea that we're heading for ecological collapse is not specific to primitivists, although some primitivists do think that. I mean, I think there are a lot of green anarchists who share that same view. I think the argument is perhaps about, well, you know, what happens or how well prepared might people be when you know the crises of that we're currently sort of experiencing become greater and greater. I'm not sure that within primitives, I don't read primitivists as determinists in the way that you suggest. I think there is a deep concern about a catastrophe, if you like, or a series of catastrophes, but I don't think that the extent to which, or the way in which primitivists see catastrophe is or parallels the cruder versions of Marxism, which say, you know, there's going to be a collapse of capitalism, and that's going to provide the springboard on which we can build socialism. I don't think it exists. I don't think that the catastrophe exists in that sense. I think it's a sense of you know, it's a depressing thought about the ways in which we destroy our world, and I'm not sure that primitivists think that there's particularly an answer to it. You know, the danger is, or the risk is, that the kinds of ecological collapse that technology is heading towards are irreparable, and therefore the incentive is to take action now to try and halt or reverse the kinds of damage that's being done.
So, you know, many anarchists are ambivalent towards, or even hostile towards, religion, but there's also a strong current of anarchism that believes in, or that would call itself Christian, or identifies with other religions. Can you maybe speak to those histories?
Yeah, so a lot of anarchists are deeply anti-religious because they're anti-clerical, and they certainly in continental Europe, the church is associated with all the oppressions of the state, and with you know, education, which is very narrow and blinkered, and they, you know, they're as opposed to the church as they are to the police or the government or any other of the institutions of the state. But there are currents also within anarchism which call themselves religious. And historically, the most famous of those, or the best known, is associated with Tolstoy, the writer Tolstoy, who called himself a Christian anarchist, not because he identified with the politics of the anarchist movement, and he was, he was notable really in his rejection of individual violence and what he called terrorism. But he called himself anarchist because he thought that he identified, if you like, with the principle of leaderlessness. And he thought that the way in which we could live in an anarchic society where we didn't have authority and we didn't have militarism and we didn't have all of those violent, he associated, I suppose, the state with violence, and the way in which we could escape violence, he thought, was through our individual convictions. So if we got in touch, or if we could understand the message of Christ, which for Tolstoy was the message that Christ communicates in the Sermon on the Mount, then we would understand that our duty was to not to inflict harm on others, and we could live our lives in ways where we were Christian to the extent that we never did harm to other people. And if anyone tried to do harm to us, then we would not try and resist them except through our non-violence. Tolstoy thought that it was better, as you know, Christ's example showed, if you like, that it was better to not to intervene to prevent violence. It was better to suffer that violence and set the example. And if we all did that, and we could do that through our faith, then we could live in an anarchist community.
And many anarchists are still pacifists today.
Many anarchists are still pacifist, and Tolstoy has an important influence on post-Second War anarchist non-violence. Tolstoy is often said to have influenced people like Gandhi. His work also influenced the non-violent civil rights campaigns, and I suppose non-violence chimed with a kind of a post-Second War anti-nuclear, anti-war sentiment. So yes, but I think a lot of people who are non-violent, or who call themselves non-violent, are not necessarily Christian anarchists, but the influence of Christian anarchism is certainly there.
And so the final group of anarchists, or the final strain of anarchist thought I want to talk about, is the sort of postmodern new anarchisms coming out of the 1960s. So like anarcho-feminism, or anti-racist, or anarchisms, queer anarchisms. Can you speak about those?
Yeah, I think that's quite complicated in a way. I mean, there are different accounts, I think, of the relationship of anarchism to some of the movements that come out of the 60s, and I think you'll find some contemporary writers would say that the feminist and liberation movements that emerged in the 60s were actually the saving of anarchism, in the sense that they sort of reinvigorated it and they gave it a politics that it had previously lacked. And then on the other hand, you'll find some people who would say anarchism sort of dovetails with these movements, such that it becomes a vehicle through which things like feminism can be properly expressed. So one of the arguments that comes out of anarchism in the 60s and 70s is that feminism is inherently anarchist because of the ways in which women activists organize in leaderless and consensual ways. But there's certainly, I think, either way that you read it, it's certainly the case, I think, that contemporary currents of activism, which think of themselves as anarchist or anarchistic, are importantly coloured by a politics which is based on a broad rejection of domination and an acknowledgement that domination can take different and complex forms. So there's an awareness, if you like, that there's not one single cause of oppression. There are all kinds of ways in which people can be dominated, and those ways in which people can be dominated are not necessarily explained by a single entity called the state.
And do you consider all of these anarchisms, whether they're from the 1800s or much more recent, different understandings of a principal idea, or different concentrations or emphases, or are they more hard and fast differentiated?
I think they can be. I mean, I think I think it's always, in actual movements, it's always there's always a danger that differences in outlook or in sort of starting points or in focus can become sectarian. But I think the distinctions between anarchist schools have not always been sectarian, and most of the time are not sectarian. So I think people who are active in anarchist movements are actually quite fluid between the movements that they work in. And I think one of the things that was I think that's particularly new in anarchism, actually, but one of the things that's become quite self-conscious within anarchism is the desire to find ways of working with people who you don't necessarily agree with on everything. So to avoid sectarianism insofar as you can, and anarchism can do that quite successfully, to the extent that there are very few groups that have hard policy documents which or sort of very narrow doctrines. There's always fluidity, even within groups which want to direct their activity in particular ways.
Well, since we're talking about what anarchists believe, I see some people and some currents in this book connecting anarchism with both liberalism and socialism as like a strain of thought, and other people and other ways of thinking reject anarchism as related to liberalism and are hostile to it. Can you speak about the relationship between these
between
different
liberalism?
Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, I think it's quite messy to try and. I mean, you're right. It has been done. People have. I mean, Rudolf Rocker was one person who famously said that that anarchism emerged from the confluence of socialism and liberalism. But I don't think he meant by that there were these two, very separate kinds of ideologies, and anarchism somehow, cherry picked from both of them and emerged as something that was sharply defined from either. I think what he was trying to point to was the sense in which anarchists wanted to, or anarchists were anti-capitalist, and anarchists adopted a critique of capitalism that had a strong kind of ethical dimension to it. But at the same time, they accepted or they didn't want to think in terms of a very narrow class politics. They wanted to think rather in terms of, or allowing flexibility for individuals to forever kind of question, experiment, follow their own conscience, to define themselves as they saw fit. So, I mean, in a way, the relationship with liberalism is as problematic as the relationship with dominant forms of socialism. So the anarchist wants to avoid what becomes dominant in socialism. That is a kind of an idea of party organisation and of revolutionary elites. That's what the anarchist wants to avoid there. And on the other hand, the anarchist sort of looks at liberalism and says, well, you know, the principle that liberals have sometimes promoted, which is that individuals are the best people to define their own interests, gets lost in a system which also says that individuals can be defined by particular rights and can be understood as people who own themselves and their own property, and through that self-ownership own other things, and equally a liberalism that supports as a principle a free market which allows exploitation.
And one way that thinkers have conceptualized that is, as opposed to liberty from, whether it's with liberalism like liberty from the state, or liberty from domination, or with socialism liberty from capitalism and like poverty, it's anarchism might be around freedom for the pursuit of people's goals, freedom for communities to decide for themselves what they want. Is that a positive or a productive way of sort of conceptualizing this, do you think?
Well, I think it's often the two concepts of liberty, negative liberty, freedom from, and positive liberty, freedom to, are often used to sort of try and work out where anarchists sit. But I'm not sure that it does work very well, because those concepts of liberty are both assume, if you like, the existence of a state. So positive and negative libertarians typically say, well, you know, your freedom from is defined by the existence of a set of laws which say what individuals, or where the boundaries of allowable action lie. So, you know, I can do what I like as long as I don't interfere with you. That's my negative freedom, and that relies on the existence of a set of laws that tell us all what we can and can't do. So the starting point for anarchism is slightly different from that, because the anarchist wants to say, well, you know, it's for us to decide, not the law to tell us what the boundaries of acceptable behaviour are. So I think I think it is more interesting or more productive, perhaps, to think in terms of how you might think of non-domination as a way of thinking about an anarchist concept of freedom, because you want to be free from domination. And how do you conceptualize that? Because you've taken away the very thing that libertarians classically require for liberty to operate, and that's the law.
And so, if anarchists believe in non-domination, you go into a little bit about utopian thinking, but what are some of the big ways that people have understood this, and how they want to see it put into practice?
Well, I think, non-domination is often contrasted to anti-statism. So, and I think that, which I disagree with. I think those two things are not incompatible. But non-domination is can be associated with particular kinds of politics. So you can think of yourself as someone who doesn't dominate and be anti-sexist or anti-colonial or anti-racist or an ecologist, or so there are different forms in which non-domination can be expressed politically. But I think theoretically it's probably best linked to the rejection of ideas of mastership, and the ways in which anarchists, I think, are creatively trying to play with this idea in practice is to think about how they organize and what the terms of organizing are. So when particular groups come together, one of the things that's become very apparent about contemporary activist groups is this practice of consensual decision making. And as part of a process of consensus decision making, it's clear that certain ground rules have to be put in place to ensure that everybody has a voice, that people feel free to speak, that, you know, particular individuals who are more articulate or more educated or more confident don't take up all of the space of the group. So if you're aware of those potential problems, then actually you can constitute your arrangements, your decision-making arrangements in particular ways, and ways in which members of the group themselves can identify what might be dominating. So you're never going to have a kind of a recipe to say, right, so this is how we organize in order to ensure that there's never going to be domination, because there's always something that you can never think of at the time. But you do become conscious of the fact that because there's a danger of domination, then you have to adopt practices that make yourself aware of that, or make the group aware of that, so that you can confront it and address it.
And so this sort of model of non-domination is, or seems like it's very similar to, or part of, prefigurative politics. So building the world that we want to see in the future here today, either by building up social institutions or organizing in our communities, and also through individuals confronting their own participation in domination and oppression, and confronting other people's as well. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's right. Although, I think prefigurative politics can mean lots of different things to different people. So, I mean, to come back to something I was saying earlier, you know, if you take a syndicalist syndicalist model, syndicalists would argue that their politics is prefigurative to the extent that the model that they adopt, the direct action that they practice through union organizing, prefigures the kind of society, because through that direct action you organize in ways that allow you to build, you know, solidarity across your movement. That is also prefigurative. So prefigurative politics can take all sorts of different forms.
Cool.
But the idea is that you're not waiting for someone to tell you to do something. And you're not waiting for a kind of a particular moment where you're going to move from, you know, bad society into perfect society.
So moving away from maybe the theoretical, you are organizing the Anarchism, or the Anarchist Research Group and Anarchist Study Network out of Loughborough University. So how do you see sort of the role of academia in resistance and organizing?
Well, that's a difficult one. I mean, there are two groups that we have. One is within the university itself. We've set up. There are you know, three colleagues of mine and me have set up a research group, and that was primarily designed or organized, I suppose, because we found that we had a number of PhD students, and we wanted to have a kind of a focal point within the university where we could get together and discuss anarchist ideas. And we brought in, I mean, it brings in people from across the campus, not just within our sort of our politics department. And that's I mean, it's a support network as much as anything else, I suppose. The Anarchist Studies Network is a national network. So that brings together scholars, I mean, both within and outside academic institutions, together in through a list, and there's exchange that goes on of information and ideas, and we organise conferences and events and that sort of thing. I think it's difficult as someone who's sort of has a position within a university, and you know, a good position within a university. It's difficult to think how actually academia it contributes to resistance, because actually you are cut off in many ways from from people outside of academic institutions. I do, though, think that there is a role, if you like, for debate, discussion, ideas, and if universities provide space for people to work on anarchism and to think about anarchism and to disseminate those ideas, then I think that's a productive use of a university. I think that's a great privilege, and it's also something that is positive.
And so what sort of reception has your work, or has the sort of broader work of the Anarchist Studies Network and your research group at your university, what sort of reception have you all gotten from the academic community?
Well, within the institution itself, I mean, people are quite enthusiastic about it, I suppose. I mean, I don't think, the university doesn't have an objection to anarchist studies work or to anarchist studies research. I think quite the contrary, actually. We've been given the space that we wanted to do what we liked. Outside of anarchist studies, I think, anarchism certainly within politics and political theory is still extremely marginal. So, the mainstream is, I think, probably still dominated by various kinds of liberalism, and anarchism is not regarded as a kind of a rigorous theory. But that's, in a sense, I don't think that's a problem, because I don't think that's what anarchists ever sort of set themselves up to be. They didn't really set themselves up to be philosophers. They set themselves up to be, critics who wanted to actually, change the world. And to the extent that I don't know, that aspiration still exists, then there's a role for continuing to reflect on what it means to be anarchist.
So my last question then is, when you look around at organizing that's going on right now, or at resistance that's going on right now across the world, what gives you hope? What are you looking at?
What gives me hope? I think there are all sorts of things that give me hope, actually. I mean, it's not just big protests. To see the television yesterday, actually, and look at the mass of students out in Hong Kong is remarkable. And I wouldn't call that their aspiration to be anarchist at all, but I think it's an aspiration that talks to a frustration and a rejection of central government constraint, which any anarchist would recognize. I think it's it's deeply troubling to think about what might happen, but I think it's very, very inspiring to see thousands of people come out and argue for greater democracy. I think at the same time it's very, very inspiring to see very small scale operations. So I came across an example recently of a chocolate factory that was set up in Grenada as a collective, and which managed to not only produce chocolate in Grenada for the first time as a collective, but export it on sail ships and distribute chocolate through on cycles, on bicycles across Europe. And this was an anarchist experiment, and it's a fantastic demonstration of the way in which you can have alternative trade and production, which is ethical and which is prefigurative. And there are all kinds of experiments that go on a very, very small scale, which demonstrate the same kind of potential to live differently and to challenge the ways in which I think we're, structured, if you like, or encouraged to live. And they do give me, I don't know, not just hope. I mean, yeah, and I think they're extremely positive.
Great. Well, Ruth, thank you so much for being on the program today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's been a pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed that episode of the Stand Up Fight Back podcast. As always, check us out at fightbackpodcast.com or leave a message at 202-750-1598. In 2 weeks, we'll have Brian Tokar on the show to talk about Toward Climate Justice and the Institute for Social Ecology. If you have any questions or comments or responses to the interview with Ruth Kinna, please let us know. You can also send an email at fightbackpodcast@gmail.com. Share us with your friends, like us on iTunes and on YouTube, I guess. Subscribe. I guess that's a thing. Not really sure on all of this podcast lingo yet. I'm sure that'll come in time. And thank you all so much for listening. Talk to you in a couple weeks. Our music today was Tennessee Mine by Sam Hill, covered under a Creative Commons Share-alike non-commercial attribution license.